Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Business Interview. It's the first Tuesday of November. For many in the business world, it's about interest rates. For others, it's about the Melbourne Cup, which of course is being run today for the 163rd time, from Archer's win back in 1861 to Gold Trip's success last year. I thought it was a good opportunity to check in on how the thoroughbred racing industry is going. So I'd like to welcome back the boss of the Thoroughbred Breeders Association, the Chief Executive, Tom Reilly. Tom, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Great to be on, Sean. Thank you very much.
Tom, it must be an exciting time of year for your industry, the Spring Racing Carnival, this sort of 4 to 6 week period, and particularly in Sydney and Melbourne.
Yeah, this is certainly the time when racing is really in the shop window on main stage. So, we've had the Everest, and of course today we've got the Melbourne Cup. So, so I'm sure there'll be millions of people around Australia watching the action at Flemington today.
So can you give me some idea of how big the racing industry is in Australia? I mean, I've done some work on it previously. It's huge.
You're right, it is huge. If we're looking at it from a jobs perspective, there are over 80,000 full-time jobs within the thoroughbred industry. If you're looking at sort of prize money, there's getting towards $900 million in prize money across the almost 19,000 races in Australia each year. But, for people who aren't really that familiar, or who may be just watching the Melbourne Cup today, Australia's got an enormous industry for the size of population. So we're the second biggest thoroughbred industry in the world after America. And obviously America's got a much bigger population to sustain that. So people around the world look at Australia as a leader in the thoroughbred industry. So, the action on the track is really highly regarded. Australia hosts more of the best races than any other country in the world. So both in terms of the quality of the action on the track, as well as the sort of economics of it, Australia really is a powerhouse around the world.
Where are we up to? Is it growing still? I mean, there was a golden period a couple of decades ago, but where is it up to now, particularly given the competition from other sports?
Yeah, so wagering has, which is obviously one way to look at it. Wagering is plateauing out post-COVID, but, still Australians love to bet and enjoy betting on horses. In terms of number of horses, those numbers are sort of dropping. So the foal crop, what we talk about, the number of thoroughbreds born each year, is around 12,500. It's been steady there for the last couple of years. But, if you went back 30 years ago, that would have been closer to 20,000 horses born each year. So it's definitely contracting. I would argue that the quality is improving. But one real big area where the industry is growing is around ownership and people participating by having a share in a horse. And so now in Australia, there are around 105,000 registered owners. And to give you some kind of context for that, the UK has 14,000. America, which has the biggest number of race horses, they've only got about 30,000 registered owners. So here, we've got a lot of people. They might not own the whole horse. They might own 5% of the horse or 10% of a horse. A lot of people who are really engaged with it.
The Melbourne Cup stops a nation. We know that. In Sydney, the Everest has sort of fast become a major race, even though it isn't a Group 1 race. How important are these marquee events?
Yeah, so in racing, we're essentially there are races going on all across Australia 364 days of the year. So it's an industry that's going non-stop. But, it's not like the AFL or the NRL that we have a grand final with all that attention, focused on one event. So having these marquee events is really important in terms of saying, hey, speaking to those people maybe who don't follow racing week in, week out, to say, hey, look, here's our industry. Here's a great day, a great event. We've really what drives it all is these amazing horses. And I'm sure even if you've got no interest in having a punt, having a bet, if you go to the races and, spend a bit of time in the mounting yard beforehand and have a look at the horses, these are sort of stunning animals, and that's what really pushes it all.
Stay with me, Tom. We'll be back in a minute. My guest today is Tom Reilly, CEO of the Thoroughbred Breeders Association. Okay, now racing isn't without its challenges, not least being the reliance on gaming. You talked about $900 million in prize money. I presume the bulk of that comes from revenue from gaming. Am I right in that? Similarly with tax take, is that right?
Yeah, so over 90% of the funding of the racing of prize money is derived from wagering or from taxes from wagering.
Okay. So there's a lot of pressure at the moment to reduce the amount of advertising being allowed in gaming. Where do you stand on that one?
Yeah, so there was a report, as I'm sure lots of your listeners will be aware, there was a report earlier in the year which had 31 recommendations looking to reform online gambling. Thoroughbred Breeders Australia are very supportive of the vast majority of those recommendations. I suppose there are two real areas of concern from a thoroughbred industry point of view. One, the report basically said, look, racing is an exception. It's different to AFL, it's different to NRL in terms of its relationship with wagering. Those sports have really embraced wagering recently as a source of revenue and sponsorship, whereas racing, you can go back to the histories of horse racing and wagering's been a kind of a component of it. So the report acknowledged this and said there should be an exemption for racing. So from a racing perspective, it's important that exemption, that sort of carve out, is significant enough so that we don't see issues there being, let's say, a form guide in the newspaper in Sydney or Melbourne. So that's one area that we're speaking to government about. And the other one, which has a real direct sort of financial potential impact, is around what the report called inducements, or what bookmakers might call generosities. So if you've got a sports bet or a Ladbrokes account and you're having a bet in the Melbourne Cup today, there's a chance that whichever bookmaker you're with might have an offer where, if your horse runs second, you might get a bonus bet back. So the report called for all of those sort of generosities to be cancelled. Now, one immediate issue for the racing industry is that all of those, let's say if you looked at sort of free bets or bonus bets, all of those bets get taxed by the racing industry. So a levy is paid to the racing industry on those. And they also get taxed by state governments. And with all state governments across the country, a proportion of what is of that tax take from racing goes back to the industry. So if those were removed, it would be a financial hit to racing.
Okay, the other issue, which we often hear a fair bit about on a day like today, is the welfare of horses. And we've had some unfortunate incidents in recent years in the Melbourne Cup. It's a perennial. Is the industry getting better at looking after horses once they're no longer racing?
Yeah, definitely. So the welfare of horses is certainly an area that I think everyone in racing is really committed to, and across the country, each racing authority is putting aside a percentage of all the money that comes into the industry for welfare, and this amounts to tens and tens of millions of dollars across the country each year. And there's some great programs. Just the other day, Racing Queensland announced a safety net, so any thoroughbred that essentially gets into trouble in retirement, they will come on and take over responsibility for that horse. And there's been some great work done, and I think that ideas like that, the safety net, I think will become national ideas very soon, and that will really help the industry and give confidence to everyone that we're not just committed to looking after our horses while they're in the industry, while they're racing, but afterwards too.
Okay, so what are the big opportunities for racing the next 5-10 years then?
Yeah, so two key things really. I think international investment is huge and is getting bigger. So the biggest sort of investor, the biggest recent investor in the thoroughbred industry is a Chinese billionaire called Yusheng Zhang. And Mr. Zhang has more than 150 horses running around Australia, which he owns himself. He's got sort of 600 brood mares, mostly based in Victoria on his farms there. We're seeing a wave of international investment. I mentioned earlier on that Australia is seen as a leader. There's good prize money here. There's a good funding model here. And we're seeing increasing numbers of owners from overseas come and want to race horses here and be involved here. So international investment is one area. And the second is the growth in ownership. So the availability of people to come and take a share in a horse and really be part of something which, if you're a footy fan, you can go and watch your team. But, if you're involved in ownership, you can actually go and own, a part of a horse and actually be involved in the conversations, know where it's going to race, have those conversations with trainers, be there when the jockey's getting legged up and getting the instructions. And more people are wanting to get involved that way. And I think that's something that's really special in Australia. If you looked, you mentioned the Everest earlier on, the horse that won the Everest was bought for $70,000. And, he has now won in excess of 10 million. So for those people who bought their 5% in that horse, they're well in front and having the time of their lives, I'm sure.
So who's going to win the Melbourne Cup today, Tom?
Okay, simple one. So the favourite, Vauban. Everyone who I speak to who is a serious student of form tells me he will just win, but he's very short odds. So if I was giving a tip to the listeners, I would suggest a little each-way bet on a horse called Ashram. And he is trained by Kieran Maher, who's an expert at this. He trained the winner last year. And yeah, so he'll be about $40 or thereabouts.
Fantastic. Tom, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you for having me on.
That's Tom Reilly, CEO of the Thoroughbred Breeders Association. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's best business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.